Picture this. You're walking through the halls of an ancient Egyptian temple, and suddenly you stop dead in your tracks. On the walls around you are images so explicit, so shocking, that they would make a modern adult blush. But here's the twist. These weren't hidden away or considered taboo. They were celebrated, worshipped, and considered absolutely sacred. What I'm about to tell you about ancient Egyptian sexuality will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about one of history's most fascinating civilizations. If you love discovering the hidden truths behind ancient mysteries, smash that like button right now and stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why ancient Egypt was unlike any other civilization when it came to matters of intimacy. Drop a comment below. What's the most shocking thing you've heard about ancient Egypt? For over 3,000 years, from around 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, ancient Egypt flourished along the Nile River. While other ancient civilizations buried their sexual practices in shame and secrecy, Egypt did something completely different. They integrated sexuality into their very religion, their art, their daily life, and even their path to the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that sexual energy was a fundamental force of creation itself, as powerful as the sun god Ra and as essential as the flooding of the Nile. This wasn't just about pleasure. This was about cosmic balance, divine power, and the very fabric of existence. But let me take you deeper into this world that would seem alien to most ancient peoples. In Egyptian mythology, the universe itself began with a sexual act that would make most modern religious leaders faint. The creator god Atum masturbated the world into existence, creating the first gods Shu and Tefnut from his own seed. But here's the shocking part. This wasn't whispered about in secret temples. It was carved into massive stone walls, recited daily in sacred texts, and celebrated in public ceremonies attended by thousands. Priests would actually perform ritual masturbation in front of crowds during certain ceremonies, believing they were recreating the moment of cosmic creation. Can you imagine walking into a church today and seeing such explicit creation stories celebrated openly? Yet for the Egyptians, this was the ultimate sacred act, more holy than prayer, more powerful than any other ritual. The fertility god Min wasn't just depicted with an enormous, permanently erect phallus. His statues were anatomically accurate and often oversized to the point of impossibility. Some Min statues had phalluses that were literally longer than a grown man's arm, painted in vivid colors and decorated with precious metals and jewels. During festivals in Min's honor, massive wooden phalluses, some over 20 feet long, were carried through the streets by hundreds of participants. These weren't subtle symbolic representations. They were detailed, realistic recreations, complete with veins, texture, and even mechanisms that could make them move and ejaculate streams of milk and honey onto the cheering crowds below. But the most shocking aspect? Egyptian queens and princesses were required to personally service these giant phallic statues during public ceremonies, performing oral acts in front of thousands of spectators, while priests chanted hymns of fertility. This wasn't considered degrading. It was the highest religious honor a woman could receive. Egyptian women enjoyed sexual freedoms that wouldn't be seen again in Western civilization for thousands of years. But the reality was even more extreme than most historians dare to admit. They could not only initiate divorce and take multiple lovers, they could actually own and operate brothels, participate in public orgies without losing social status, and even demand sexual satisfaction from their husbands through the court system. Legal papyri reveal cases where wives sued husbands for sexual inadequacy and won monetary compensation. Egyptian courts had detailed procedures for evaluating sexual performance, including witness testimony from neighbors who could hear through walls, and even physical examinations by temple physicians to determine if a husband was fulfilling his conjugal duties properly. Women could also engage in what we would now call swinging, organized partner-swapping parties that were not only legal, but were actually encouraged by religious authorities as a way to strengthen community bonds and ensure genetic diversity. The papyrus records contain far more than just love spells and basic aphrodisiacs. They include detailed instruction manuals that read like ancient versions of the Kama Sutra, but with explicit religious and magical components that would make modern tantric practitioners blush. The Instructions of Ptahhotep contains a section on sexual technique that wasn't translated into English until 1973 because scholars considered it too graphic for publication. It includes detailed anatomical drawings, step-by-step instructions for dozens of positions, and even advice on sexual positions that were believed to influence the gender and personality of children conceived during those acts. Egyptian love poetry was so sexually explicit that Victorian archaeologists literally buried many papyri rather than translate them. When these texts were finally examined in the late 20th century, scholars discovered that ancient Egyptian erotic literature was far more advanced and explicit than anything produced in Europe until the modern era. The Turin erotic papyrus, discovered in the 19th century, contains images so explicit that many museums still won't display them publicly. But it's not just pornography. It's a sophisticated instruction manual showing positions, techniques, and rituals that combine sexuality with magic and religion in ways that no other ancient culture ever achieved. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed entire libraries of erotic texts. In 2019, excavations near Saqqara uncovered a cache of over 200 papyri dealing exclusively with sexual practices, magical enhancement techniques, and detailed anatomical studies. Many of these texts are so explicit that they remain untranslated and unavailable to the general public even today. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I discovered about their most sacred sexual ritual. Are you ready for this? The highest priestesses of certain temples were required to engage in sacred prostitution as a direct communication with the gods. But here's the twist that historians debated for decades. This wasn't just any sexual act. These priestesses, called God's wives, would undergo months of preparation involving specific diets, purification rituals, and training in ancient tantric-like practices. They would enter a trance-like state through combinations of incense made from blue lotus flowers, rhythmic drumming that lasted for hours, and consumption of fermented honey mixed with psychoactive plants. During their sacred encounters, they would supposedly channel the voices of the gods themselves, speaking prophecies and divine wisdom while in the throes of ecstasy. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about witnessing these ceremonies and described them as the most profound religious experiences he had ever seen. He noted that men would travel from across the Mediterranean, paying enormous sums, sometimes their entire life savings, for just one night with these divine intermediaries. The women weren't seen as prostitutes but as living goddesses, and their children were considered blessed with divine blood. Even more shocking, the practice of necrophilia was not only accepted in certain circumstances but was actually legally protected under Egyptian law. When the wife of a high-ranking official died, her body would be kept for 3 to 4 days before mummification. Not just for mourning, but so that her husband could have final intimate encounters with her spirit as it transitioned to the afterlife. But it gets even more disturbing. These weren't quick, secretive acts. The rituals were elaborate, involving specific oils and perfumes applied to the deceased, positioning the body according to astrological calculations, and timing the acts to coincide with certain phases of the moon. Priests would actually supervise these encounters to ensure they were performed correctly for maximum spiritual benefit. The Egyptians believed that sexual energy could literally bridge the gap between the living and the dead. They thought that by maintaining intimate connection during the crucial transition period, couples could ensure they would be reunited in the afterlife. Tomb paintings show couples engaged in intimate acts that were meant to continue in the underworld, and many mummies have been found with detailed instructions carved into their sarcophagi about sexual practices in the realm of Osiris. Archaeological evidence from the Valley of the Kings reveals that some tombs contained actual beds with restraints and positioning devices, suggesting that these post-mortem encounters were more elaborate than anyone previously imagined. But perhaps most mind-blowing of all, incest wasn't just accepted among royalty. It was considered divinely mandated by the gods themselves. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, mothers even married sons in some documented cases, all in the belief that keeping the bloodline pure would maintain their divine connection to the gods. The famous Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was actually the product of at least 12 generations of brother-sister marriages. Her family tree looks more like a family pole. There's almost no branching at all. The genetic consequences were devastating, as we can see from CT scans of royal mummies showing severe birth defects, clubbed feet, temporal lobe epilepsy, and shortened lifespans. Yet the practice continued for over 2,000 years because the Egyptians believed that the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was literally a god in human form, and gods could only mate with other gods. To marry outside the family would pollute the divine essence and potentially destroy the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous. The ceremonial aspects of these incestuous unions were even more shocking. Royal weddings involved public consummation ceremonies, where the couple would perform intimate acts in front of the entire court, while priests chanted incantations to ensure the union would produce divinely blessed heirs. These ceremonies could last for days, with different sexual positions being performed at specific astrological moments. The fertility god Min wasn't just worshipped quietly in temples. His festivals involved some of the most shocking public displays of sexuality ever recorded in human history. During the festival of Min, which occurred annually during harvest season, entire cities would engage in what can only be described as massive public orgies. Women would dance naked through the streets. Men would expose themselves while carrying enormous phallic symbols, and couples would engage in public intercourse in the fields to fertilize the land with human seed. The festival lasted for 7 days, and participation wasn't optional. It was considered a civic and religious duty. Archaeological excavations have uncovered festival sites with evidence of these mass gatherings: stone platforms with drainage channels for bodily fluids, discarded pottery with explicit imagery, and even ancient Egyptian instruction manuals carved into stone showing hundreds of different sexual positions that were considered sacred to Min. But here's the most shocking part. Children as young as 14 were expected to participate in these festivals as part of their transition to adulthood. There were specific rituals where virgin boys and girls would be initiated by experienced adults in front of crowds of cheering spectators. What we would consider child abuse was, for the Egyptians, a sacred rite of passage blessed by the gods themselves. Now you might think these were just extreme religious practices, but sexuality permeated every aspect of Egyptian daily life in ways that would seem impossible today. Egyptian children received explicit sexual education from temple priestesses starting at age 10. But this wasn't just basic anatomy. They learned detailed techniques for pleasure, spiritual aspects of sexuality, and even advanced practices that wouldn't be documented again until modern tantric texts. By age 12, both boys and girls knew more about human sexuality than most adults in medieval Europe would learn in their entire lives. The coming-of-age ceremonies were elaborate affairs lasting several weeks. Young people would spend time in special temple complexes where they learned not just the physical aspects of sex, but also the emotional, spiritual, and social responsibilities that came with adult sexuality. They practiced with trained instructors, adults whose sole job was teaching proper sexual technique to the next generation. Archaeological discoveries have revealed entire rooms in these temple complexes filled with explicit teaching aids, carved ivory models showing anatomy, stone tablets with detailed instructions, and even practice furniture designed for learning proper positions and techniques. What modern society hides behind closed doors and whispered conversations, the Egyptians celebrated with elaborate educational institutions. Marriage contracts were legal documents that would shock modern sensibilities with their explicit detail. These weren't just agreements about property and children, they included specific clauses about sexual frequency, preferred positions, times of day for intimacy, and even seasonal variations based on agricultural cycles and religious calendars. Some contracts specified that couples must engage in intimacy at least every 3 days during the flood season, daily during planting season, and twice daily during harvest. Others included detailed descriptions of sexual positions that were considered most favorable for conception during different lunar phases. If a spouse failed to meet these obligations, it was grounds for divorce and financial compensation. The contracts also included provisions for sexual experimentation, with some documents listing specific practices that spouses agreed to try, complete with detailed instructions and safety precautions. These weren't one-page agreements. Some marriage contracts were longer than entire modern legal documents. Egyptian homes, not just temples, were decorated with art that would be considered pornographic by today's standards. Bedroom walls featured detailed paintings of couples in various intimate positions, often with anatomically accurate and exaggerated details. Kitchen pottery was decorated with scenes of sexual encounters, and even children's toys included dolls with removable clothing and anatomically correct features. The famous Turin erotic papyrus wasn't hidden away in a secret vault. It was likely used as an instruction manual in ordinary households. Copies have been found in middle-class homes throughout Egypt, suggesting that explicit sexual guidance was considered as normal as cooking recipes or farming instructions. Furniture was often carved with erotic imagery. Beds featured headboards depicting various sexual positions. Chairs had armrests carved in the shape of phalluses or vulvas. And even dining tables were decorated with scenes that would make modern dinner guests choke on their food. The Egyptians developed contraceptive methods so sophisticated that some weren't rediscovered until the 19th century. They used everything from crocodile dung mixed with honey, which actually created an acidic environment hostile to sperm, to intricate copper devices that functioned essentially like modern IUDs. But they also went far beyond simple contraception. Egyptian texts describe elaborate enhancement techniques involving specific dietary regimens, exercise routines, and even surgical procedures designed to increase sexual pleasure and performance. Both men and women underwent procedures that modern medicine is only now beginning to understand and replicate. They used cosmetics not just for appearance, but because certain scents and colors were believed to increase sexual potency. Men would apply kohl around their eyes in patterns that supposedly enhanced their attractiveness to both gods and mortals. Women wore intricate makeup that took hours to apply, with different colors and designs for different sexual purposes. The jewelry wasn't just decorative either. Both men and women wore intimate piercings made from gold, silver, and precious stones. These weren't simple adornments. They were functional devices designed to enhance pleasure for both partners. Archaeological evidence suggests that even elderly Egyptians maintained these intimate modifications, showing that sexuality remained important throughout their entire lives. Egyptian medical papyri contain detailed sections on sexual health that rival modern medical textbooks. They understood concepts like erectile dysfunction, female arousal disorders, and sexual incompatibility between partners. Their treatments involved combinations of herbal medicines, physical therapies, and psychological counseling that wouldn't look out of place in a modern sex therapy clinic. They had specific treatments for premature ejaculation, inability to reach orgasm, painful intercourse, and loss of sexual desire. Some treatments were surprisingly effective. Modern analysis has shown that certain Egyptian aphrodisiacs actually do have genuine physiological effects on human sexuality. But perhaps most remarkably, they understood that sexual problems often had emotional or spiritual causes. Egyptian physicians were trained to counsel couples about relationship issues, communication problems, and spiritual blocks to sexual fulfillment. They saw sexuality as inseparable from overall health and well-being in ways that Western medicine is only now beginning to rediscover. But this extraordinary sexual openness couldn't last forever. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and eventually reached Egypt, everything changed dramatically and violently. By the 4th century CE, Christian authorities weren't just converting Egyptians, they were systematically destroying 3 millennia of sexual wisdom and practice. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in 312 CE marked the beginning of the end for Egyptian sexual culture, but the real devastation came under Emperor Theodosius IV. Christian monks, driven by religious fervor and sexual repression, became the shock troops of cultural destruction. They didn't just close temples, they smashed statues with hammers, burned libraries containing thousands of sexual instruction texts, and used chisels to deface wall paintings that had survived since the time of the pharaohs. The famous Library of Alexandria, which contained the world's largest collection of texts on human sexuality, love poetry, and relationship guidance, was systematically purged. Scholars estimate that over 100,000 documents related to Egyptian sexual practices were destroyed in just 2 decades. Texts that could have advanced human understanding of sexuality by centuries were reduced to ash and rubble. Christian authorities issued specific edicts targeting Egyptian sexual practices. The edict against carnal practices of 391 CE didn't just ban sacred prostitution, it prescribed death by crucifixion for anyone found practicing ancient Egyptian sexual rituals. Former priestesses were given a choice: convert to Christianity and take vows of celibacy, or face execution as practitioners of demonic fornication. The last of the sacred prostitute temples was closed in 391 CE by order of Emperor Theodosius, but the final closure wasn't peaceful. Historical accounts describe a siege lasting several weeks, as the last priestesses and their followers barricaded themselves inside the temple of Isis at Philae. These final defenders of Egyptian sexual culture fought desperately to preserve their traditions. They managed to hide some texts and artifacts in secret chambers, though most of these caches were eventually discovered and destroyed by Christian investigators. The siege ended when Roman soldiers finally breached the temple walls and found the priestesses had chosen mass suicide rather than abandonment of their sacred calling. The priests and priestesses who had maintained these traditions for millennia were either forced to convert or were executed as heretics. But the psychological transformation was even more devastating than the physical persecution. Within just 1 generation, Egyptians went from celebrating sexuality as divine to viewing their own bodies as sources of sin and shame. Former participants in fertility festivals now flagellated themselves in Christian monasteries. Women who had once proudly served as sacred prostitutes became nuns sworn to perpetual virginity. The complete reversal was so dramatic that some historians describe it as one of the most successful cultural genocides in human history. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was how completely the sexual knowledge was buried. Christian authorities didn't just destroy Egyptian sexual practices, they rewrote history to pretend they had never existed at all. Byzantine Christian scholars created sanitized versions of Egyptian history that portrayed the ancient civilization as sexually pure and modest. They literally chiseled the genitals off statues, painted clothing over nude figures in wall paintings, and burned any historical accounts that mentioned Egyptian sexual practices. For over 1,000 years, the true nature of Egyptian sexuality remained completely hidden from the world. It wasn't until Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, and especially the discovery of the Turin erotic papyrus in the 19th century, that modern scholars began to uncover the shocking truth about how sexually liberated ancient Egypt really was. Even today, many museums and textbooks still downplay or completely ignore Egyptian sexual practices. The complete picture of Egyptian sexuality has only emerged in the last few decades, as archaeologists and historians have finally begun to piece together the evidence that Christian authorities tried so hard to destroy. Within just a few generations, Egypt went from being the most sexually open civilization in human history to one of the most repressed under Byzantine Christian rule. A culture that had celebrated human sexuality for 3,000 years was transformed into one where even thinking about sex was considered a mortal sin. Looking back at ancient Egypt's approach to sexuality, we see a civilization that understood something we're still struggling with today. That sexual energy is a fundamental part of human nature and spiritual experience. While some of their practices seem shocking or even abhorrent to modern sensibilities, their basic approach, integrating sexuality into daily life rather than hiding it away, created a society where sexual dysfunction, repression, and shame were virtually unknown. The Egyptians lived for over 3,000 years with an attitude towards sexuality that was simultaneously more open and more sacred than anything we see today. They saw no contradiction between the physical and the spiritual, between pleasure and worship, between the erotic and the divine. Perhaps the most shocking thing about ancient Egyptian sexuality isn't what they did. It's how completely we've forgotten their understanding that sexuality, when approached with reverence and wisdom, can be one of the most powerful forces for human connection and spiritual growth. What do you think? Could modern society learn something from the Egyptian approach, or were some of their practices too extreme? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to a side of ancient Egypt you never knew existed, subscribe for more shocking historical truths that textbooks never taught you. The next time you see those majestic pyramids or golden death masks in a museum, remember, you're looking at the legacy of the most sexually liberated civilization in human history, and that's a truth more golden than any pharaoh's treasure.